Good evening, everyone. My name is Ware Harmon, and I'm the Executive Director of Town Hall Seattle. On behalf of the rest of the staff here at Town Hall and our friends at LA Bay Book Company, it's a pleasure to welcome you to tonight's virtual presentation of Suchitra Vijayan and Dr. Amrita Ghosh. As we get underway, I want to acknowledge that our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, and particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continuing use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. We are very glad you're back with us as we commence another season at Town Hall. It's our 22nd. This will be a year, you can be safely assured, this will be a year unlike any other, featuring in-person events, virtual events, and what we're calling hybrid events, which I don't think need any further elaboration. You'll get the point. We're also continuing our scaled up podcast In the Moment, which features exclusive interviews of authors, artists, and newsmakers by Ginny Palmer, Steve Scher, and other local correspondents. Meanwhile, many of our past talks are available in video or podcast form in our digital media library. There's lots of ways to engage with Town Hall in this strange liminal year. Tonight's program will run approximately an hour, including a Q&A. To integrate our in-person and virtual audience experiences, we've changed the Q&A platform for our events. To submit your question, please enter meet.ps/Vijayan, that's Vijayan, or scan the chat and remind folks again in the audience later when we get to Q&A about how to manage it. And we can't guarantee we'll get to every question, but we'll try to get to as many as possible. You can do your part by keeping yours concise. For those who'd like to view the program with closed captions, visit click the CC button in the bottom right corner of the video player. Town Hall's adding new events every day. Upcoming programs include a look at quarantines, past and very present, with authors Nicola Twilley and Jeff Maynaw, an exploration of the relationship between our biological systems and the political, social, and economic injustice with Dr. Rupa Maraya and Raj Patel, and a 20-year survey of the polarization of American politics and culture with New Yorker writer Evan Osnos. Finally, we also feature 3 events celebrating extraordinary local voices, an evening of collected essays by Seattle Times and South Seattle Emerald journalist Marcus Harrison Green, original music inspired by Susanna Ryan's Seattle Walk Report from Town Hall favorites, the Bushwick Book Club, and a celebration of 30 years of Savage Love featuring the irrepressible Mr. Dan Savage himself. Those last 2 events will welcome live audiences back to our building, so you won't want to miss that opportunity. Check our website and subscribe to our e-newsletter to get the latest updates. Town Hall's programs are made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our civics programs are supported by the Real Networks Foundation, the True Brown Foundation, the Norcliffe Foundation, the Caffin Foundation, and the Wyncote Foundation Northwest. But finally, as most of you know, Town Hall is a member-supported organization, and I want to thank all of our members watching tonight. If you share our vision of a community invigorated by arts and ideas and shaped by engaged citizens, we hope you'll consider supporting us with a contribution or by becoming a member. And though I just said finally, I'm now about to say lastly. I realize that's fine editorial work on my part. You'll definitely want to learn more about tonight's topic. And the best way I can think of is to purchase Suchitra's book, Midnight's Borders, for your own self. We've made this very easy for you. Just use the link in the chat below to pick up your copy through LA Bay Book Company. I should say Third Place Books, my mistake. And when you do that, you'll serve the dual goal of supporting a local independent bookstore at a time when they could certainly use the love. And with that, Suchitra Vijayan was born and raised in Madras, India. A barrister by training, she previously worked for the United Nations War Crimes Tribunals in Yugoslavia and Rwanda before co-founding the Resettlement Legal Aid Project in Cairo, which gives legal aid to Iraqi refugees. She's an award-winning photographer and the founder and executive director of the Polis Project, a hybrid research and journalism organization. Her work has appeared in the Washington Post, GQ, the Boston Review, The Nation, and Foreign Policy. Dr. Amrita Ghosh is a research fellow at SASNet, South Asia Center, Sweden, an associate faculty member at the Brooklyn Institute of Social Research. Dr. Ghosh is also co-editor of the coming anthology Tagore and Yeats, a post-colonial re-envisioning, to be published in 2021, covering themes of translation, authorship, and the Nobel controversy between the 2 writers. Vijayan's book, Midnight's Borders, A People's History of Modern India, is the subject of their discussion this evening. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Amrita Ghosh and Suchitra Vijayan.
Thank you so much, everyone, and hello, Seattle. I'm Amrita, and I want to welcome Suchitra, and I'm delighted to have this conversation and this opportunity to talk about this book, a very important book, Midnight's Borders. And before you begin talking about the book, I want to start with the title itself. The title is Midnight's Borders, and immediately it has an echo of Rushdie's Midnight's Children and Nehru's famous Tryst with Destiny speech, in which he refers to the nascent nation state, Midnight's Hour. Why is there this added notion of time and temporality, the midnight, to the borders and margins of the nation state?
Thank you so much for being in conversation with me, Amrita. It's a huge pleasure and a privilege. I also want to thank the good folks at the town hall at Seattle for making this happen. So when we named the book, it became very clear that there were going to be comparisons to Rushdie's remarkable novel, but also, as you rightly pointed out, allusions to Nehru's Tryst with Destiny. But this book is definitely not an ode to the Rushdian novel. It doesn't think in those terms. And similarly, this book is also not one that venerates Nehru either. But instead, what this book really I wanted to do was speak about those farthest away from centers of power, those who never got the opportunity to define what it means to think about freedom, what it means to define their own sense of community. So Midnight was not just these great themes and titles, but for me, Midnight was also the moment of devastating birth. I think one things about Nehru's speech, and one has to start with Nehru's speech, because it's the speech that if you grew up like me in 90s India as a young person, my father was a child. My grandfather was a child of the independence movement. He was one of independent India's first political prisoners. My father was born on the years after 1947, and I was the classic child of liberalization, which meant that the India that I grew up in had some remarkable things that generations before didn't. And yet Nehru was still a looming figure in terms of the fact that people still knew who Nehru was. Tryst with Destiny was one of the first things you encountered. And this is a remarkable speech because it's an ambitious speech. It's an audacious speech because all of a sudden over 200 million people who were less than colonial subjects were all equal before the Constitution. And just as this revolutionary constitution gives, or at least guarantees, these rights, what you really see is that the birth of India begins with a massive bloodshed. And for all purposes, it was Holocaust on wheels. And 17.8 million people lost their homes and moved. This is the greatest human migration in history. So even as we were celebrating, or the generation then was celebrating these acts of freedom, what you really had was a story of great violence. So for me, Midnight is this, it begins with the moment of darkness. And I don't think because we never really confronted the darkness or the dark days that followed, I think the trauma of partition still haunts so many of us. My family was not directly affected because my family is based in the south of India, but almost every person who lived through this had to live through what was, in all purposes, not only incredible violence, but also something that would remake the subcontinent and millions of lives. So Midnight then becomes more about the moment of great violence and what it did to us than whether it being a Rushdian book or a book about Nehru.
I'll come to the part with the subtitle, and it is very interesting to me. You call it a people's history of modern India. So in that, are you trying to specifically focus on the subaltern experience, literally from the peripheries of the nation state?
You know, the people's history is a very remarkable word, because in the US, the first time I encountered the people's history was Zinn's The People's History of United States. The book had a remarkable effect on me because it taught a generation of young people how to think about history. But I also realized that I couldn't write the Zinn's version of history, because he was writing about a different country. He was writing about history of slavery. He was talking about the American experience of understanding oppression, and how do we think about those histories. It was impossible for anyone to, you cannot think about the people's history of India the way that Zinn talked about the people's history of India. Instead, the people's history of India begins in medias res, in a way, in the middle of something. And then for us to really understand and interrogate what India is, you also had to go back and interrogate who was telling the story of India. How was the story being told? Because who gets to shape our social worlds then gets to define who gets to tell the story. So who has been telling the story of India in the last 75 years? I know there are some notable exceptions, but if you look at what is seen as the grand definitive history of India, it's been said by a very specific kind of a person, often upper caste, upper class, someone from immense wealth and privilege, if not money, then at least cultural and other privileges. And that story in some ways gets told over and over again, often, I don't want to say the silenced, because I think, as you and I say rightly in the book, the people in this book who appear in this book are eloquent voices who articulate their predicaments, their politics, their histories with so much clarity and empathy and defiance and courage that they don't need an interlocutor. So I early on decided that this book, I wasn't going to give people a voice. I wasn't going to bear witness. Rather, I was going to use these remarkable people who appear in the book as a way for us to interrogate, what does it mean to think about the nation? What does it mean to think about questions of freedom, identity, citizenship, belonging? But can we think of them in a different way? So I think when you tell the story of India, it's impossible. One goes back to the initial question. There's a remarkable line in Salman Rushdie's Midnight Children, where he says that to understand me, you have to understand many histories. And I think that is true of all of the people who appear in the book, is that to begin with one story, each individual who appears in this book, their stories are multitude. It's unruly, it spreads. There are multiple acts of migration, multiple stories of violence, the multiple stories of resistance. How do you encompass all of this? You cannot. So you start with the belief that this people's history is going to be a map of belonging that is already being drafted by others. And I don't know if I succeeded, but that's why it began. And then, of course, every little word in the subtitle is contentious. Who are the people? What is this history? What is this modern India that we're talking about? When does this sense of modernity begin? What is India? Because the book starts with the Afghanistan-Pakistan chapter. So in that sense, so in so many ways, I think the title and the subtitle are constantly militating against each other.
And you also mentioned, I think it's fascinating, in the last 75 years, how do we think about the post-colonial nation state, and how do we rethink belongings and identities, especially if we look at from the borderlands. And I found this particular quote from your prologue, and I'm quoting you here: "Maps are objects of power and they do not belong to the people. Maps are keepers of a state's knowledge, the distances, the miles, the nautical miles, and where things begin and end," end quote. And of course, map making itself is a colonial project. And along with that, the borders and the borderlands, and you beautifully show, hauntingly show in the book, they become fuzzy spaces, unique spaces. They also threaten the idea of the nation state, as you show through the experiences of the people. How do we then imagine a post-colonial nation state like India in the present time that decolonizes itself from the legacies of this very complex colonial and now imperial border making?
Thanks for that question. And I think it's a provocative question, but it's also a very difficult question to answer. I want to start by saying that almost all of the people I encountered in the book were already making their own maps of belonging. Their sense of history, belonging, the way they tell their story is already vastly different from the way we encounter history and narrative and story in what, say, one would read in the already existing, canon of India's literature, whether it is the work of Ram Guha, whether it's the work of Professor Thapar. So already what you see is a very slow and a constant attrition and revolution, even in the way these people tell their stories. And I think that's very important, that the map of imagination, you can control the map of the territorial sovereignty, but the map of imagination, the map of belonging, you can't take it away. And I think every story in the book in some ways talks about that act of militating against these things, but also learning to live with it. And for me, what was really important was to really go back and think about what are the ways in which a colony could have organized itself, right? I mean, what ways could we, because we did come out of a long battle against imperial and colonial oppression. There was a fight against a very specific kind of rule, which not only oppressed and destroyed, but also took away from vast majority of colonial people their rights and dignity. So what were they thinking when they said that once we got freedom, how could we imagine that freedom? But the reality is that none of these things are new. If you look at Gary Wilder's book, Freedom Time, you see two post-colonial intellectuals, Azer and Senghor, West African Francophone intellectuals, are having a lifelong conversation about how do we imagine our freedom? Can we imagine freedom outside the bounds of territory? Are we going to, once we get the freedom, organize ourselves like the imperial powers, or are we going to do something different? And these conversations were not only happening in Francophone Africa, they were happening in East Africa, they were happening in Egypt, they were happening in India. Tagore was having these conversations about how we shouldn't be thinking about nationalism as the roadmap to bring these people. Baba Saheb Ambedkar talks about the idea that the concept of political freedom will never come true because social freedom, social equality was never going to happen. So these conversations are as old as the fight against the empire itself. And I think the sadness of all of this is that somehow we've forgotten to have those conversations. Now, every conversation, if it goes against a certain way of thinking, you're automatically branded as anti-national. So I think the question now is not how do we decolonize ourselves. I think we really need to envision a better way of living. We know that the freedoms that were promised in the stroke of midnight in 1947 hasn't come to bear. There are great grievances. People have been denied their rights in so many ways. Climate change is going to fundamentally remake the world. Authoritarian regimes and ways of running the world is how most of even democracies now are increasingly authoritarian. So what we are seeing is and living through is an age of crisis of citizenship. So in some ways, this project of understanding the future is not a utopian one. And I think we really need to figure out what the future is now, because otherwise, what do we have left? And I think that's very important. I think that's the way that I've thought about the book.
Thank you for that. And something you said earlier struck me. You said that through your travels, and you traveled 9,000 miles along the border, which is an incredibly contentious borderlands, and you engaged, met, talked with, and spent time with incredible number of people talked about their experiences, but you said something that you didn't want to give them a voice, and you said that they did not need a medium to speak through. And I've been thinking about the book and the two kinds of mediums you merge. There's photography, and then there is obviously the stories of the people from the borderlands. And there are two things I'm thinking of. The photographs by themselves have this very powerful affect in the book. And then you're merging them with the stories. So why merge the two different medium, writing and photography, to document the stories? And then I'll add the second part to the question, which is, if photographs, are you using the photographs for witnessing? And if there is this ethics of representation, and there's this complex, there's this complexity in representing, as you said, they don't need a voice, then how did you navigate as a writer in your representation of some of the most marginalized and oppressed people from the borderlands of India?
Okay. It's interesting that you've put both of this together, because I usually get asked both of these questions as two separate things. And I'm glad that for the first time you've kind of asked these questions as one question. So when the project started, it started when I was doing my graduate work in the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. So I spent a lot of time in Afghanistan. And initially, this was supposed to be my graduate thesis. This was supposed to be where I would think about. And also I got to Afghanistan and I was embedded with the US military in the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. So initially I went there with a very political science kind of a question, like why has the world's largest territorial army, the United States Army, unable to deal with insurgency? And what's happening in these border areas? Once I got there, it became very clear that my question was insufficient, but also what I was seeing in front of me was very different than, by the time I got to Afghanistan, this was already 2010. So already 10 years of war had happened. The war in Iraq had happened. The Samara bombing had happened. I got to Afghanistan just around the time when General McChrystal's surge was being very severely. So this was 10 years ago when they had started discussing what the withdrawal of the US troops in Afghanistan would be. So for 10 years, when I was, so 9/11 happened when I was 17 and leaving high school. And over the last 10 years, I had seen a very specific kind of narrative: images, texts, reporting, academic work. There are some very good ones that came out, but those were few and far in between and an exception. Once I got to Afghanistan, I realized that the images, the stories, nothing made sense, because what I was seeing in front of me was absolutely different than the stories I'd been told over and over again. Whether it was these stunning looking American soldiers shot in their bunkers, or the ways in which even the New York Times and everybody else reported. The spectacleization of war was not what you saw. On the ground, it was dry, it was empty, it was brutal, but the violence was unending. So first I had to understand the visual, political, and the narrative dissonance of someone who had grown up on the shadows of 9/11, who could not recognize a country that had been reported so extensively. So also once I got there, I was doing two separate things. I was doing my oral field work in a more academic way, and I was still continuing to take photographs because I've always been a photographer. And it became very difficult for me to stick to one form or the other. And somehow I had to find a way to bring all of this together. And that took me a really long time to figure out what the form and the narrative would be. So that's the more thing about having difficulty. I'm not one of those writers who knows exactly what I want. I'm one of those people who starts from the place of not knowing, and I spend a lot of time trying to learn. So once I came back from Afghanistan, I really wanted to, the one thing that I kept going is, if I similarly traveled the outlines of the Indian Republic, what would I find? So that's how this book kind of happened as something that came out of my Afghanistan, Pakistan work in the borderlands. And with the India work, initially, I didn't want it to be academic. I didn't want 4 people to read. With a lot of academic work, you write for 4 people. Eventually, the peer review, and then your writing goes and dies in some journal, unless you are lucky enough to be cited again. So I definitely didn't want to write for 4 people who were very specific about how I should sound. So initially, the India project started as a photography project. It would be a full-blown photography project. And I would simply have, everything would be built around the photographs. It would be a scrapbook. It would have poetry, ruminations. And then I realized that was a very terrible idea, because photography could no longer, was not enough. And also, I think I was very afraid to write about what I was seeing. I was very shocked about I was coming back home after 10 years, and I was also very shocked to witness. I was also very afraid to actually write down what I was seeing. But when I came back from the first leg of travel, it became very clear that I had to write. If I was going to write, this could not be a photography project. I actually had to teach myself to write in the most honest and simple way possible. Not preachy, but in a way that would be truthful. And that language took a really long time to get right. I think I wrote, I don't, at this point, I think my agent Lucy would know how many revisions I did, but it took a really long time. So that was a process of crafting this book, is that I was also living through it, because the India project started in 2013, a year before Prime Minister Narendra Modi comes to power. And then the last of my travel happened in the end of 2019, early 2002. And in those 7 years, India had transformed in so many ways. The subcontinent had transformed in so many ways. So a lot of it was also really thinking about bearing witness to the present, even before bearing witness to the people. So that's the first part of the question. The ethics of representation, I think I learned ethics by being a photographer, simply because, not by being an academic or a lawyer. As a lawyer, my job was very specific. It was to make sure that I got as many people, mostly asylum seekers and refugees, out of a country and protected. As a lawyer, my role was very specific. I prosecuted war criminals. But as a writer, it's just, the burden is much larger. I believe that burden of a writer is much larger than a burden of everything else that one does in life. So I learned ethics by being a photographer, because would I be okay photographed in my most vulnerable? No, right? So why is it okay for us to turn that lens on some of the most marginalized, some of the most communities that are farthest away from power? So more than marginality or oppression, I think these are communities that are robust, that know exactly what's happening. Their life is made of accommodation and resistance. But what defines them is that they are farthest away from power. So the very fact that I have a camera or a book or I've traveled automatically makes me infinitely more powerful than them. So it's not an equal relationship. So how do you make that equal? So I made everybody who's in this book a collaborator in this project. I know a lot of journalists will never send back transcripts. So when I would record my conversations, in some cases I sent the transcripts back and I said, is this okay? In other times, I would try and read the entire chapter with the translator on the other end to make sure that they got it. And by the time we finished the book, it became very unsafe. So September of 2019, a month before my manuscript was due, the book fell apart because a lot of the people who were in the book no longer wanted to be in the book. 2019, a lot of things happened. The revocation of Article 370 meant that I had to rewrite the Kashmir chapter completely. I couldn't thank a lot of the people in the book because many of them were people putting their name in the book would become too dangerous. Apart from Article 370, you had the citizenship laws that were passed. Again, people who had gone through generational violence. Again, another thing you'll see the people in the book is that once the violence begins, the violence has a prehistory. It doesn't begin at 1947. There's a longer history. And you see how the cycle of violence keeps playing on and on and on. So when people no longer wanted to be a part of the book, I let them go because not all stories need to be told. It was not my job. That's why it was not my job to bear witness. My job was to listen to the people who trusted me enough to speak to me. Similarly with the images, all of the images was shown. I made sure people were comfortable with the images. In one case, there's an image that appears in the US edition of the book, but doesn't appear in the India edition of the book because I didn't pay attention to it. My editor did, and she said, in this case, the person in the book, there's a name, there's a village, and now we also have the photograph. So what if, so in this case, we kept everything else, but took the photograph away. So those are all choices that we made because we felt that eventually the safety of the people was important, because that was more important than, again, the philosophy being not all stories need to be told, not all images have to be taken. And what's the function of an image, that is brutally violent? Would we like to be photographed when we are brutalized? I don't think so. So I think those are the considerations. I don't know if I did a good job in all of this, but I think it was definitely, over the 7 years, it was definitely a learning curve in terms of deciding what works and what doesn't.
I think we can show one image out of the book. Can we share one image right now, if possible? And I wanted to talk about this particular image, if we can share it on the screen. And also, you mentioned earlier that this was initially, at least conceptually, sort of a photograph or a collection of images project. We have the image on the screen. And I wanted to know, did all the images or the photographs that you have, that you took, appear in the book, or only certain numbers? And how did you decide on them? But if you can please speak about this particular image on screen.
Okay. I'll take the last question first. There are about 40 original images in the photograph in the book. Sorry, there are 40 original photographs in the book. But I have about 600 images or more. 600 images with images that were shortlisted. I mean, not shortlisted. I did like an initial edit of everything else. So over a period of over 10 years, I had over thousands of images that were there. The selection was again about the fact that, again, in the book, there are no captions because I didn't want them to be there to be captions. Captions have their own violence. Rather, the text and the image had to flow with one another. So that was very important. The way we designed the book feels, especially if you look at the India book, it feels like your personal scrapbook. And that's how we designed the book. It's supposed to be something that one holds very close to one's heart. So the book was meant to have the text and the image. The image was a paragraph. We thought of the image as a paragraph. The image was not outside the conversation. The image was very integral to what we were doing. And this image is one of the earliest images that I took even before I started the India project. This was in Paktika province, Afghanistan-Pakistan border. And this happened on one of my earliest embeds in Afghanistan, where I was looking at what was happening to these communities. And this young boy belongs to the Afghan local police. So around 2010, 2011, the Americans and the NATO forces decided that the best way for them to fight the Taliban, rightly or wrongly, would be to create these local community defense forces. I mean, gathering a bunch of young boys in some of the most impoverished war-torn landscapes and giving them an AK-47 and $100 a month has never been a good idea. But in this case, that's what happened. And of course, often the US Army had its own quotas. They said that they outsourced the ALP to local warlords who would then round up the poorest, the weakest members of society and forcefully conscript them into these ALPs. And this was an image of one of those boys I photographed. He was barely 15. And if you see this image, and also a lot of these boys ended up wearing hand-down images from the US soldiers. So you can see him wearing the vest with the bullet casings. He had a bit of a chipped tooth, but because I was talking to him, he was very conscious. So I thought he looked gorgeous with that big smile, but because he was being photographed, he tried really hard to keep his mouth closed. And you can also see that in his hand, he actually has a little bit of an M&M. That's another thing that American soldiers did. They gave M&Ms to everybody as if that was a solution. But again, you can see how happy he was that he had the M&Ms. And this image for me is the image of what war was. And of course, none of these boys lived through the spring. This was taken in December of 2011. And by the spring of 2012, all of these young boys and men were dead because you're already sending these young men and boys to war. And this image for me is a reminder of how we think about war. Also, I didn't take photographs of American soldiers. I only took photographs of Afghans on the ground because American soldiers had some of the biggest propaganda platforms in the world, telling their version of the story. The great Salman Rushdie actually soon after 9/11 said that let's give war a chance. I don't think that Guardian essay actually is fared well. So war in some ways has not only taken so much out of them, not in the last 20 years, but that image tells you the deceit of what war is, that the real account of war can never be taken. And this boy is gone. And this image, of course, appears in the book. And I remember when I went back, they didn't let me go back because I'd already done a series of scathing essays about this. So they didn't let me go back and embed in the same place. So I couldn't go back and find out what happened. But I did Skype the interpreter who I worked with when I was in Afghanistan, in that base. And he told me that, that he didn't remember the boy, but he remembered the photograph that I took of him. And then, like all Afghans, working for the American force, he said, at least when he was alive, he had nothing, now he has 6 feet of land. And the first thing that came to mind, and it appears in the book as well, that I say that children, the graves for children are 4 feet, it's not even, he doesn't even have 6 feet of land. He barely has. So I think that's what the function of the image does, is that you don't need images of war and devastation to tell you how brutal the last 20 years, and of course the last how many ever years you want to go back has been for Afghans or any of the other people appear in the book. And I think that was important. And that's also another way in which we thought about putting the book and the images together.
Thank you. I want to, before I move on to the next part, I want to remind the viewers to send in questions to the chat. We will be having a Q&A right after. The next question to me, or the section of your book, is extremely important for the work that I do on the Indo-Bangladeshi border. And I found this extremely interesting. You speak of the shifting border, or the very porous Indo-Bangladeshi side of the border is one of the most complex borderland spaces in the world. It has rivers, it's water bodies with land, and it's shifting, you pointed out. And you have the story of Ghazi. And I'm using, again, the words spoken by Ghazi, quote, "The partition did not just happen and the war did not just happen. It is unfinished, incomplete, and ongoing," end quote. And for 74 years after independence, since the first partition, let alone the Indo-Bangladeshi border, which, it itself is so complicated, there are these enclaves called chitmahals. These are pockets of land surrounded by, as you know, the other host nation. And idea of belonging is fraught. You don't know whether you're Indian or a Bangladeshi going out of your house sometimes, or the back of your house could be belonging to the neighboring nation state. So in 2015, there was a historic borderland pact by India and Bangladesh. And it feels like, and in my own work, I have traced what has happened in the aftermath of that, and it doesn't seem like these spaces have really developed into legitimate belongings of the nation state. And so I think of them as spaces of abandonment, sort of different from the other conflict zones or the other borderland spaces. And I would be very curious to know if you found in your travels, if it was before 2015 to the Indo-Bangladeshi borderland, if it was specifically different in any way from the other borderland areas that you have traveled to. And if you could access any of the chitmahals, which are really highly under surveillance from both India and Bangladeshi border forces.
So I started the India-Bangla border, traveling along India-Bangla border in 2013. So this was just before the exchange. Access to them, it's very, the thing that I've always found very fascinating about the borderlands, especially the Bengal borderlands, is I always thought that I would get stopped. I was always expecting to be stopped very often. But once I got there, it just was, people always made it easy for me to get from point A to point B. Even in places where you had a strong militarization, you had strong BSF control. And all of these places, again, you understand that the India-Bangla border, for those who do not know, is part porous, part fenced. It's not as military, has completely shut off and militarized like the India-Pakistan border, but there are still places in which also the land conditions mean that it's impossible, even in places where they have put fences, reclaimed land, the water finds its way. The water always finds, the memory of the water finds its way. So it's a very interesting space, even visually, physically, a place that keeps transforming. So this was also, I found that by this time, by the time I was traveling, these enclaves and enclaves had become a subject of great fascination. Almost everybody who was studying the borderlands, rightly so, did go to these spaces and they were studying it. So when I went there, one thing that you found was that, so again, for those who do not know, so in some of these enclaves, you would have, because this was once a princely state, you would have India surrounded by Bangladesh, surrounded by India, surrounded by, so it's this very weird, not weird, it's a very,
it's an absurdity.
It's hard to, and then I start understanding that, of course, some of the things that happens is that these places are highly surveilled. There is no real development, which means that the local populations depend entirely on the border security forces of both India and Bangladesh for something as simple as clean drinking water. The very act of a young schoolgirl going from one point to another point and coming back would mean she would probably have to cross 6 or 7 checkpoints, get stopped, get harassed. And often here, people were trying to just live. just survive, not even live. I mean, people were just trying to survive. That was the base. And that act of survival, they did everything in their capacity. So everybody here would have both an Indian SIM card and a Bangla SIM card, because you really had to, that's how you negotiated and navigated life. And often to get the Bangla SIM card, you'd have to bribe someone across, because you, as an Indian citizen, you cannot. But this often from the state's point of view is seen as an act of criminality or illegality, where they say, how dare you commit? This could be terrorism. But in reality, these are people who barely make something, I don't want to say less than $1 a week, but that's how much they made. They really didn't have, their movement was already highly restricted because of where they were, because the very act of even moving 10 meters would mean you're in a different country. Second, these regions have been underdeveloped for so long. Climate change means that the once lush farming lands are under erosion, which means that farmlands can no longer give you what it is. Unemployment is rampant. Often these communities migrate out of these spaces to go elsewhere. And this was not just the case of the enclaves and the exclaves, or, it was also the case of all of these borderlands, is that people were barely managing to survive. And I think this goes back to our conversation about the act of giving over 200 million people in 1947 political equality did not automatically guarantee social equality. And in that process, there's a lot of conversation about smuggling. And one of my first conversations, and I asked, and then in a conversation with Ghazi, he says, this was one of my first conversations, one of my first trips, 2013. Ghazi starts rattling off. He says, what do people smuggle? Chilies, baby powder, baby milk powder, onions, saris, cough syrup. He says, like, we are not, in a sense that, some of that conversation did make the book. He says, like, we're not diamonds. We're not smuggling diamonds. We are smuggling the things that we need, because how else do we live? So it was very important to just explain away. And again, you can't talk about these things. You can't preach about these things. You can't talk about the great indignity of being robbed of your freedom every single moment of your life. And it was important to bring as much reality and texture to that conversation. And I think those, and I think in that sense, it was not just these places, but all of these borderlands would, in some ways, was similar.
Right. You said something very fascinating earlier, and you said that in this particular Indo-Bangladeshi borderland, moving from point A to point B was not that difficult, and it somehow the border security forces or people would help you. And you said that you could move around pretty freely, and to me that's a surprising element, but also I'm guessing it's an outsider within this particular space, which is not inhabited so much by coming and going of people. But since the partition of 1947, women crossing borders has always been a very dangerous act, if not been completely thwarted. So in your travels, was it difficult to cross borders or be in contentious borderland spaces? And I will add something to that. How did traveling to these different kinds of borderlands surrounded by different nation states in India, how has that changed your understanding of borders after writing the book?
So your experience is always in a continuum, right? So in a place like the India-Bangla border, someone like me is always more powerful. I am more privileged. At the end of the day, I'm still someone who comes from the privilege of caste and class. At least I have I have a Hindu father, which means that automatically puts me in a very specific place. I'm English speaking, which also, so I was very, very cognizant of my powers, my privileges, and where I didn't have that.
Mm.
So, for instance, this book cannot be written now. I don't think the kind of places that I could go, that I traveled, that I had access to is possible now, because the India of 2012 and 13 no longer exists. It has completely changed. I could see how it had changed by the time I had left the Bengal borderlands, traveled through Kashmir. Of course, all of these places also taught me different ways. In all of these spaces, the privilege I had was that when I would travel, I'm a small, dark-skinned woman who spoke English, but also once you pulled my hair back, and I would often wear full-hand shirts, really baggy trousers, it was very difficult to place my caste and class location. Nobody would know what religion I was, because there's nothing that I would wear no earrings. My hair pulled back. Also, I was darker. I was darker than most people would encounter. So often people didn't know where to place me, except that they assumed I should have some kind of privilege, which always protected you, at least protected me. I don't think it will protect you everywhere. In some places. But what gave me real protection was the fact that I always worked with the local communities. The people that I trusted, my friends, the local communities that I lived with, they were always the ones, for some reason, protected me. Without the consent of the communities that I was having conversations with, all of this would have been very, very dangerous. Having said that, for most of my adult life, as I wrote this book, as I worked, as I lived, whether it was Cairo or Arusha or Afghanistan, or in all of these places, I lived as someone with an Indian passport. I was one of the very few people with an Indian passport who was doing the kind of work I was doing. I'm still in many places, I was one of the only few brown, I'm still one of the very few people of color in many of the spaces that I occupy. And it comes with its own sense of humiliation of how you're treated. And I think just as I understand how I could have a certain kind of power in these borderlands, in other parts of the world, I am absolutely powerless. We've all seen what happens to brown and black bodies in this country, especially if you don't act and perform a certain way. We've seen what happens to the kind of anti-Asian violence that's happened over COVID. So in that sense, I've always felt both someone with privilege in certain places where I could still do all of this. And even as I had those privileges, you can understand how the passport regimes around the world, borders make unequal people, right? Borders always make unequal people, right? An American who has an undergraduate degree could parachute into Kabul and make $200 a day, while an Afghan with a PhD working for the same organization would make $200 a month. This is how war played out as well, the political economy of war. Why was that? We know that people of color consistently get paid less, who are treated differently. Even today, publishing has a huge discrepancy. Majority of the people who get published tend to belong to a certain race, class, and privilege. So I think we cannot write without placing ourselves in the continuum, understanding where we have power and where we are absolutely powerless. And that is true of all of us. And I think the struggle is to then, once you have a little bit of power, or whatever power you accumulate over the course of whatever you do, is to then make sure that you redistribute that to create more equitable spaces. But having said that, I think all border regimes make unequal people. And that is something that we have to talk. It does not just South Asian borderlands. It's true of the United States as well.
I do have one final question on one of the most militarized spaces in the world, Kashmir, and your final chapter, Records of Repression. But I want to quickly take one question that had come before from the audience. What was the most unexpected thing you encountered on your 9,000-mile journey?
Unexpected. Good unexpected or bad unexpected?
You choose.
Okay. I'm always, the unexpected was how remarkable the people of the subcontinent are. Just the ways in which they exist. I think Sari Begum in the book is a good example. They're funny. I'll narrate two incidences, both of this, because we've also spoken quite a bit about the India-Bangla border. I'll talk about this one of this, the border where in the Rajasthan border, one of the border security guards that I speak to is, he's just absolutely, he's funny in a way that is, it shows you that all war is just sitting around, right? So he used to be someone who worked in the India-Bangladesh border, and now he's now in the Rajasthan border, which is the India-Pakistan border. And he says, look, this border is so boring. I don't know what to do. And there's a moment when he's so bored that he says that, he's never seen a porcupine before. So he encounters a porcupine for the first time. And he says, look, all I did was, and he has his old military hat. And he says, I was so bored, I was trying to put the military helmet on a porcupine's head and take a photograph. And I thought that would go really viral on Facebook. And then, of course, by the time he could take the photograph, the porcupine runs away. And the way he narrates it is just, again, this sense of humor, the dry sense of humor that appears behind one of the most militarized borders, right? That was one of the absolute brilliance and the funny, the remarkable humor, the humor and the dry sense of dealing with what the world is. The other one is Sari Begum, whose farmland actually has a military bunker and when I first meet her, she says, what are you doing here? And I say, I'm traveling. I'm trying to make sense of the world. And she says, you're a stupid girl. Why would someone travel 9,000 miles to understand the world? You should have just come to me first and I would told you how terrible and nasty and greedy this world is. In that sense, I never understood why all of these people actually made time to speak to me. I've never understood why anybody would make time to speak to an absolute stranger. So the good part of it was just the sense of humor, the dryness of it all, the sense of clarity of who they were, what they are, and what they stand for. And I think that was refreshing. What was unexpected was how I saw the country change in those years. When I was in Rajasthan, a very, very brutal lynching had taken place just a few hundred kilometers away. And people were talking about it. People were afraid. You could see a sense of fear. After 2015, it became more difficult for people to have that same openness, have that same sense of inviting people and talking, because nobody knew. Especially in these communities, there was a sense that everybody was spying on them. There was a sense that, the sense of trust that was so open and willing. I could already see that fabric of trust and generosity and openness that I had encountered so often in the beginning of the travel was already beginning to chip away. Mm. And towards the end, people just said something. I remember this one individual just literally said, Suchitra, I know we've had these conversations for over 4 years. I know you sent the transcripts, you've read the chapters to us, but it's just become so unsafe. If they know that I spoke to you, I don't know if I would be safe. And it's very easy for people to identify who this is because of the information I'm giving you. And it broke my heart, not because those stories didn't make the book, because eventually you cannot tie these. If I didn't tell it, somebody else will one day. If somebody else doesn't, these stories will be passed on.
Mm.
I'm not worried that these stories in some ways were lost, but what really bothers me is that a fabric of what kept these communities together were beginning to, I could see that, I could feel that. Perhaps I couldn't articulate it so well as I was experiencing it, but now with the distance of time, now the book is done, it's out. And now when I go back and think about it, I definitely see how, yeah, I think that's definitely something I wasn't expecting, at least not so quickly.
The porcupine story does hauntingly remind me of Sadako Sanmanto's Dog of Titwal, who's straddling borders India and Pakistan, and the military trying to grab it for themselves. So it's a very fascinating moment in your story also.
Yeah,
I don't know if you can have two questions or one question that's slightly over time, but I'll quickly ask one more question from the audience. If you couldn't have photos in your book, what other medium would you use to tell these stories authentically?
Oh, can you repeat the question one more?
If you could not have photos in the book, what other medium would tell these stories authentically?
One of the other things that we couldn't put in the book because of laws, and India has a law that very specifically say that any way of altering or tinkering with the map of the Union of India is an offense. In almost all communities that I went in, people had their own maps. People drew their own maps. They had their map of their community was not the map of India. They remembered the map of an undivided India, or in some cases of a nation that they wanted. And I think that would have been a very fascinating, rich way to tell the story. Not the maps that the state makes, but maps that people have drawn. I found these, other one is the scrapbooks that people kept. This was true, especially in Kashmir and even in Manipur. People kept their own scrapbooks that were made of newspaper cuttings because you couldn't have the images because of surveillance, because either communities were so brutalized and traumatized that the photographs, family albums were then used as a way to identify everybody. So a lot of Kashmiris, this happened in Manipur as well, would just destroy their family albums, especially in the 80s and 90s in the height of the insurgency. So instead, they started keeping these little cuttings. People have their diaries. So we actually, as I put this book together, we couldn't put those things simply because, one, the book would be, it was an illegal offense. Even maps that people draw of their memory or their imagination of what they think, the way they draw their own communities, all of that I think would have been a very fascinating way to think about, just oppose it. Stories, other people's. But again, this book is a result of a very specific period of time, as a very specific body of work. I was a photographer before I became anything else. I've been taking photographs since I was 17. So long before the digital revolution, long before anything else. But I no longer feel comfortable taking certain kinds of photographs. So maybe my next book will not have photographs. Maybe. So I don't know. So I changed. There are certain photographs that I will no longer take. I used to take a very specific kind of photograph because I've always used film cameras, which meant that I learned photography techniques through the darkroom. So I can't take, it's easy to take a good black and white photograph. It's infinitely harder to take a good color photograph. So all my photographs are black and white, and people think it's because I'm serious. And no, it's because I don't know how to take good color photographs, right? And that's my handicap. Because I can never get the settings right. But now I also see how black and white photographs are used to convey a very specific kind of pathos. I don't want that anymore. So this book, I can, for example, if I wanted to do something very similar, in the American borderlands, the book would not look like this. Not that, I mean, I would never do another story about borderlands ever. I think I'm done after 7 years. But this book is a result of a very specific period of time. It's also an evolution of who I was as a writer and a photographer to what I am. So maybe this book could have kind of gone back to the sense of found objects as a way to tell stories, but that's harder to do it really well. Everybody does found object stuff, but not everybody does it really well. So I would, yeah.
Sorry about that. Because we're running out of time, I want to quickly go back to Kashmir, and you mentioned Kashmiris and, you know, keeping of albums and scrapbooks. In your final section on records of repression in Kashmir, you mentioned the story of Hilal, very disturbing story. Eventually he dies. And there's this particular line from that section. In Hilal's tragic story, the border was not just a line that two nation states fought over. It was also the basis of an internment camp filled with the fear of unknown violence, waiting around each corner and sustained by deep corruption, end quote. And of course, the conflict of Kashmir goes back to this long partition unresolved from 1947 and from before, not just the partition. And yet I'm wondering, because you have this particular chapter and the stories of the people in a sense of borderland experience, and it is, I'm completely agreeing with you, but does it also take away some of the larger complexities, putting down Kashmir to a territorial conflict mainly, whereas there are these multiple sides to sub-internal conflicts, Jammu, Ladakh, the valley itself, Azad Kashmir in Pakistan, Gilgit, Baltistan. And they all have different sorts of these conflicts, people's aspirations in the understanding of conflict. How did you negotiate that within that chapter?
So Kashmir chapters and all the chapters that just fell apart with Article 370. And I really had to go back to Hilal's chapter, which was very different initially. And Hilal's chapter was supposed to be just a standalone essay I had done separately. But I knew that this book couldn't do everything. You know, this book, yes, I traveled for 7 years, 9,000 miles, but what you have in front of you is a fraction of the material that I collected. So at some point in time, I realized that this was not a Kashmir book, but rather Kashmir is an important part of this book. And I had to do justice to the people. And that's why the Kashmir chapter is told like a Rashomon story. And I knew that there was going to be a lot of people who have very strong opinions about, especially in the mainland, about what Kashmir means and what it stands for. Even within Kashmir, you will understand once you're there, even for a brief amount of time, is that like all communities, Kashmiris don't speak with a single voice, and no community speaks with a single voice. Their idea of freedom, their idea of what it means to fight for it, Azadi means so many different things to so many people. And multiplicity is exactly what defines any community. I'm Tamil. I grew up in Madras all my life. If you ask the average Tamilian what the Dravidian movement means for them, or all of them would have very different views of it. That's true of all of us. All of us have different ideas of what India is. And that is the plurality of it. That, I hate the phrase idea of India. I think more intellectual damage is being done by that phrase than anything else. But having said that, multiplicity of ideas and views is what is very, very common to all communities. And I cannot speak for Kashmiris. I can never speak for Kashmiris. It's their fight, it's their struggle. What I can do is tell a story of an individual story of loss, immense loss. In this case, a young man is killed in an encounter, a young man with a large family who's about to get married, and we have no idea why he was killed. The family tells a different story, the army tells a different story, the police tell a different story, the local informers or collaborators who are accused of killing him tell a different story. Nothing seems to make sense. We know that this young man was tortured. There are 2 different medical reports. Every corner you turn, you do not know what is real and what is fake. All that we know for sure is that there is a dead body of a young man who's been killed. A young man who had a family, who had responsibility, who was about to get married in less than a few days. Why would he cross the border to become a militant? There's nothing in his story of his life, and yet here he was killed. And then there are other characters like the 2 collaborators, the local Kashmiris who are charged with this murder of tricking him into, taking to this place. Then there's the army's version. But at the heart of it all is a family struggling to understand why their son died. You see judicial misconduct by the police, by the army, and also the fear that everybody lives in. Even those accused of putting him in a position of encounter killing, if you listen to their story, they all have this immense violence that's been consistently thrust upon them. And you're left with a family who still doesn't know what happened to their son. The case is still ongoing, and we don't know what happened. And that story, I thought, told through multiple perspectives with documentation, legal documents, the police saying one thing on the document, the army saying one thing, the phone records, the calls, the fact that even before dying, Hilal tried to save the very men who tried to kill him. I think that was important. And I felt that that story perhaps would allow for others, no matter what they might think, the moment to empathize with that one family. And perhaps if we empathized with that one family, we could bring it in ourselves to empathize with the over 8,000 Kashmiris or more who have died, who remain in mass graves, who have not returned home. That we can think about this in a way that returns the question from the territorial sovereignty to the dignity of 8 million people who have unequivocally said that they want a kind of freedom that you and I might not agree with it, but that's the freedom that they want. And I think that was important. And people don't have to agree with what that freedom means, but I think people had to understand that this is what has happened, that people are living in circumstances that deny them of dignity and freedom every single day. And what is our solution to that? And of course, there's a question of Ladakh. Of course, there's a question of Jammu. There's a question of the Jammu massacre. There's a question of the Pandits. And no one should be denied of their home and their dignity. And that's what I think I tried to do, knowing very well that this is not a Kashmir book. And even if you write a Kashmir book, and Amrita, you do this, your work is on Kashmir, you know how hard it is, because no one book can ever encompass all of this history and conflict and everything else. But most importantly, I just wanted to make sure that people understood how important freedom and dignity is, not only for Kashmiris, but for anyone who lives not only in South Asia, but globally.
Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. And with that, I think I have covered all the questions by the viewers. There's one that you already have gone over in your responses about being a woman writer. in the borderlands. So I'll wrap this up and thank you. This was absolutely fascinating to go over the book. And I will thank the Town Hall Seattle for this opportunity and give over the mic to you.
Thank you so much. I just want to say thank you to both of you for sharing this evening. That was really profound, but also very informative. So on behalf of our town hall audience and Seattle, thank you so much for being with us. Do pick up a copy of the book. It sounds like it has a wealth of amazing stories and information in it. As our partner bookseller tonight is Elliott Bay. There's a link to pick up the book from them in the chat. And once again, thank you both so much and have a great evening.
And thank you for having us.